standing.
Standing.
I'm here.
You could.
Will this work? This where you speak?
Right.
Or?
Yeah, talking to.
Hello.
No.
I don't. I can shout. I'm good at shouting.
You can
I'm
take
known
it.
for shouting.
Yes.
I have a reputation for shouting. But I won't shout because that would be bad. Standing under the fobbed, impendent belly of time. Tell me the truth, I said. Teach me how things go. The other lads were itching to have a bash, but I thought wanting unfair. It and finding out clash. So he patted me on the head, booming, "Boy, there's no green in your eye. Sit here and watch the hail of occurrence clobber life into a shape no one sees. Can you look at that straight?" "Thank you," I said. "Oh, yes, please." And I sat down to wait. Half-life is over now, and I meet full face on dark mornings, the bestial visor bent in by the blows of what happened to happen. What does it prove? Sod all. In this way I spent youth, tracing the trite, untransferable truss advertisement. Truth. Hello. I'm sorry about that. You probably weren't expecting a poem. But I woke up with that in my head this morning. It's a Philip Larkin poem called Send No Money. It's a poem I've known for 25 years. And suddenly was running around my head. So I spent a bit of time trying to figure out why. I think it's partly, oh, I'm not going. Why am I not going? Because I'm not doing that.
There's a clicker
there. My slides aren't nearly as impressive or funny as Stefan's, so you're maybe not missing anything. The slide you're missing says bestial visor. That's partly just because I wanted to do a slide that said bestial visor. It is at one level a poem about looking like shit at 5 o'clock in the morning, which is maybe why it was in my head at 5 o'clock this morning. So that was possibly what was there. But it's also, don't worry, it's fine. They're mostly just bad jokes.
Okay.
I can do those live. It's the next slide. I've just done audio descriptions of my non-existent slides. The next slide says "Death of Hope," because I think that's also why it was in my head. It's a poem about the futility of youthful overconfidence, of this belief that you have when you are young, that if you just pay attention and try hard enough and keep your eyes open and look at enough stuff, you will figure it out. You will get to a point where you know how things work, where somebody has told you the truth. And I think that was in my head coming to this conference. In the last 10 years that I've spent in the games industry, the first 5 years I've spent preaching, really, lecturing, defending to everybody. Look, bestial white, I promised you, and you got it. You might even get Death of Hope if you're lucky. Yeah, no, Death of Hope, awesome. So, yes, I spent 5 years touring the world, preaching through print and in talks about the potential of games, about their potential to tell deep and subtle stories in ways that we were only beginning to understand, and about their potential to have extraordinary impacts on the people who played them, to change the way they think, the way they felt about themselves, even perhaps the way they behaved, depending on the kind of game. I should probably interject at this point and say I'm coming very much from the video gaming part of the world, so interesting to interface this against the kind of work that you've been hearing about earlier in the day. But then I spent the next 5 years trying to deliver on some of those promises, and am becoming increasingly less confident about making them. The more I've tried to do computer games that have stories of the integrity and interest of the stories that I admire in other spheres, the more I've consistently hit boundaries around that make that very difficult. When I've tried to make games that affect how people behave, often with the very best of intentions, I've consistently found it much, much harder to deliver the specific and desirable results out of those constructions that you want. So, in a mood that Philip Larkin would approve of, I'm finding myself increasingly pessimistic about the potential that I was once so thrilled about, and feel, particularly in the current rather fevered culture of gamification and anything being possible as long as you stick a badge on it, feeling that anyone who promises this stuff, or certainly anyone who tells you that it's easy, is probably selling something. So I didn't mean to leave you with death of hope for so long. It's a little bit more gloomy than I wanted to be, because I think that was only the initial reason why that strange poem was in my head, because that's only one of the things that it's about. What it's also about, arguably what it's primarily about, is one of the most powerful forces in the universe, something that we don't understand very well, but I suspect you all use in your work all the time. Curiosity. It's a poem about curiosity. Tell me the way things go. A poem about being driven so strongly by an urge to find out. We don't know a lot about curiosity. We don't really know what it is. There's quite a lot of good and interesting literature about this from psychologists and neuroscientists and behavioural economists who are still having debates about whether it's most useful to think of it as an emotion or whether it's more useful to think of it as one of our core basic drives, something that sits on the same level as hunger or thirst. One of the reasons that it puzzles behavioural economists so much is that it's an incredibly contradictory impulse. On one level, it seems to make sense. When we don't know something, it drives us nuts until we can find out what that thing is. And so, because we find the sensation of not knowing the thing, not knowing what's in the box, not knowing what's behind the door unpleasant, we will invest energy, time, resource, money to find out the answer to that unknown. And there's lots of really lovely research showing the extent to which people will do that, the amount that people will pay to find out the ending, the amount that they'll value an experience which they think is going to give them closure over one that they think isn't going to give them closure. So that seems to make sense. Not knowing is unpleasant, we spend resource to get to the knowing. Brilliant. Except, we also spend resource to get the experience of not knowing. It's why we go and see thrillers, it's why we buy mystery books, it's why we laboriously wrap birthday presents in paper to hide what's inside them. So behavioural economists, who sometimes are a little bit easy to befuddle, get a bit befuddled at this, because they go, well, if it's an unpleasant experience that we resolve by spending resource to resolve it, then why do we then spend more resource to recreate the experience that we want to get ourselves out of? So there are really interesting dynamics driving this behaviour. And I think as a consequence of that, you get really interesting dynamics out of it in ways that I think are super relevant for games. So this is a lovely example of the power of curiosity. This is a building site around the corner from my office. Thanks to the lovely Olympics, London is largely a building site at present. And this is a little window cut in the wall of the building site. You see these quite often now. The reason that they're there is to stop people climbing over the wall to find out what's inside. Now, these aren't just any walls. These are walls that have two important features. One of them is loads of signs stuck on them that say danger of death, and little pictures of stick people being mutilated in a variety of unpleasant ways. Plus also it's a wall that if you climb over, it's illegal and you could go to prison. So this is an offering that says, here is a thing that you can do that might kill you and could get you arrested, and people still do it. But if they put the window in, most people don't, because they can satisfy their curiosity without having to, nearly die. So the degree to which we're willing to transgress to satisfy our curiosity is super interesting. But it's not only negative impacts. I was on a flight a couple of weeks ago out of Heathrow, and we were delayed again at the gate And that delay at the gate thing before you leave is the worst airline delay. Like, you've just got a plane full of stressed, frustrated people who don't know why they can't leave. And it was not a happy experience. No air conditioning, too hot, everybody angry. And the captain came on the tannoy and said, I'm terribly sorry for the delay. He was a British Airways pilot, so he did say, I'm terribly sorry for the delay. But we are awaiting a container, the contents of which I can't divulge, but which we can't leave without. And the change in the energy in the plane was incredible. Suddenly, people were doing things like making eye contact and talking to strangers. Because everybody was going, well, what's in it? What's in it? What do you think? Is it this? Is it that? Is it an organ transplant? Is it a Emir's Chihuahua that has to get to New York? What is it that we can't leave without? And I was amazed at the degree to which curiosity seeded two really precious things. It seeded that sociability, that communication that came out of it, and imagination. That everybody was drawing pictures of what could possibly be inside this mysterious stuff. And I don't know, I can't say you curiosity, we never found out. It was probably just moist towelettes. But the captain, who was a smart storyteller and manipulator of people, knew that by giving us that to chew over, we were less cross, and it worked. Really, really good tactic. So, transgression, imagination, communication, really interesting things that pop out of curiosity. And I think it's something we can be a little bit more scientific about how we use. I think it's embedded in an awful lot of game design work. I think lots of people are working with it already. But the need to find out is so strong that it actually, in many cases, overrides our qualitative judgment over the calibre of the thing that we're engaging with. I have waded through terrible airport novels. I have sat in foreign hotels and watched incomprehensible telenovelas because you want to find out what happens. The minute you dangle that possibility in front of somebody, it overrules a lot of more rational responses. And I think, although when we have these discussions, when we talk about story, we're nearly always talking. There's a word that we never say out loud, but that's always implied, which is we're not. This isn't a thing about storytelling in games. This is a thing about good storytelling in games. We're all here because we want to know how to do this stuff really, really well. But I'm increasingly interested in how impactful it can be, even when you don't do it very well, even when you just do a little bit of dangling. So managing that curiosity gap is really important, because curiosity hinges on knowing what you don't know. If you just don't know, if you don't know there's a box, you're not interested in what's in the box. You need to know there's a box and not know what's in the box. And keeping track of what your players don't know they know, is that the right way around? Yes. Is no. What they know they don't know, one of those, is really, really interesting and quite hard, because you're in the the game master position where you know everything. You know what every button on the interface does. You know what's going to happen to every character. You know what's in every room in the dungeon, whatever it is that you're building. And keeping track of what your players don't know lets you manage a kind of really, really important dynamic that you can get all of these interesting behaviours to jump out of. Curiosity seems to be driven mostly by these two vectors of proximity and specificity. So it's hard to be curious, that kind of really itchy need to find out curious about really, really big, vague things. I'm not curious about the contents of every book in the British Library, right? I don't know that material. I know I don't know it, but you can't be, that's everything. You can't be curious about that. I need something specific to catch my attention. If you look at the person sitting in front of you, and just in your own mind, quietly, don't say anything, just wonder what kind of pants they're wearing. That is something I can get curious about. But I can ruin it by being too specific. If I now tell you that the person in front of you is wearing either grey pants with black elastic and no trim, or grey pants with black elastic and white trim, you're now not having as much fun as you were a minute ago when I don't want to know what you were imagining, and let's never talk about this again. is probably the best plan. So finding that middle ground of specificity is important, and finding the middle ground of proximity is important. How close am I to getting my curiosity resolved? Because if it's too distant, I'm going to give up and be dispirited. If it's too soon, you haven't milked my state of curiosity as effectively as you might otherwise be able to do. Because I think there's a really important thing here, which is the more I've been thinking about curiosity, which I've been doing quite heavily in the past year, and the more you look for it in places, the more you find it being used in books and films and poems and adverts and games, the more you understand the kind of really simple, massive, terrible, crucial thing that's at the heart of it, which is this, in Philip Larkin's deliberately curiosity-triggering words. This is his little disguise in the poem of the thing that arguably the poem is really, really, really about, which is truth. Is everyone old-fashioned enough to know what a truss is, or maybe not? A truss is it's like old-fashioned Spanx. It's support underwear that keeps your hernia or your belly where it's supposed to be. So this is a kind of poem that riffs off a lot of the language of adverts and cheap newspapers that promise you the earth, that if you just, what's called send no money, if you just trust the promise, you'll get the magical thing back, except you never quite do. Trust is being quite overrated. But actually, the thing that drives our curiosity, the thing that we're defenseless in the face of, is the finding out, is the knowledge that is contained within that box that we can't see inside, because knowledge is power, and because power is safety, fundamentally, our ability to better control and predict our surroundings, starts to make sense of why curiosity does belong on a rung as low as hunger and thirst and procreation, because this is fundamentally about our ability to understand and manage our environment. And suddenly, when you're thinking about stories from that angle, and you're thinking about stories answering the curiosity drive, your thinking moves from this slightly reductive approach, going, well, stories are just curiosity engines, they're just ways of manufacturing an artificial curiosity gap, which allows me to jerk people around a little bit, scream, and get them to do what I want, which is horribly reductive and undermines a great deal of the interest in the calibre of the storytelling that's being done, into actually something that I find even more daunting, which is that in all of these things, even the most throwaway and facile ones, what we don't tend to articulate very much is that what people are chasing is truth. We hope in the stories that we consume to catch some little reflection of our own world, of our own lives, of our own selves, that help us be better prepared for events that unfold around us. It's why, substantially, at the moment, we are so enthralled and appalled by endless reality TV, because this makes explicit a poem that the promise that what you're being offered is truth, is reality, is this valuable piece of information that will help you better understand the world. Of course, those are just very cleverly repackaged and not very good fictions, but the facade that they're given is incredibly important. So this means, having been feeling guilty about making grandiose promises for the possibility of games and storytelling, and trying to step back from that, I've ended up stepping rather more grandiosely beyond it into promising work that communicates greater dramatic truths. So at Hide&Seek, we have worked in the past year on a game. It's a game that tells a protagonist's entire life story. It's a game that has over 100 NPCs. It's a game that tackles themes of hope and lust and compromise. It's a game, it's a story which responds pretty emergently to to individual players' inputs, and it's a story that does good work of producing those behavioural elements that you get out of curiosity, so triggering transgression or sociability or imagination. Took about 15 minutes to make. It's this. I'll let you read it. You'll play it on the bus home, I tell you now. So this was one of about a dozen tiny games that we did for the South Bank Centre, the big art centre on the south bank of the river in London. And we designed a bunch of games, stuck them on vinyl floor tiles, and just left them around the place. And at some level, they're incredibly throwaway. Some of them definitely barely games, some of them definitely not games, some of them properly functioning games. None of them necessarily what I would once have called story games. I mean, this very this very clearly isn't a story game, except it is a story game. It's the ultimate story game. It's 100 stories in your head that I didn't have to write or code or illustrate or do any of that stuff for. And it's a huge, huge joy to get to wander around, take and eavesdrop on people playing and watch. You can see. You don't even necessarily need to be within earshot. You can, because we know where all the things are. You can see the couples who are standing, starting out by having fun and then rapidly discovering that they're getting into very hot water on a relationship basis as they play around with this idea. And you can trigger all kinds of extraordinary things in these tiny spaces. And so I think my initial Larkin-induced demoralisation stands true. I think I still feel that I've overpromised. I particularly feel in the ideas that I've had over my last 10 years of doing this, in thinking about the ways in which games can deliberately impact on the choices and lives of the people who play them is probably overstated. And I still am hugely daunted by the task of really trying to tell stories that resemble the stories that we tell in linear mediums, in games, in ways that are as satisfying. Now, there are a ton of people, you've heard from most of them today, doing staggeringly impressive work. I am profoundly looking forward to being proven endlessly wrong on this. But I'm also aware that in the conversations I have about this stuff, particularly within the video game world, we've been talking about the same 12 games for the last 10 years, pretty much. That the pace of evolution is kind of still incredibly slow. The challenges are huge. We keep making it harder for ourselves in all of these different ways. And I confess to being frustrated by conversations about plot and narrative and character and dialogue and these things that we are inspired by from all of these other mediums, which have had centuries, in nearly all cases now, to resolve a really relevant set of tools to their particular medium. And I find now that when I think about storytelling in games, when I think now about the kind of work I want to do, I'm thinking about things like curiosity, I'm thinking about things like truth, I'm thinking about how much storytelling I can create and leave in the world and not try and close that loop, not worry about finding ways to bring the outcome of that invention or transgression or imagination back into the game because I am yet to feel able to do that. And so instead end up making arguably, art pieces that are more provocations than pieces of interactive storytelling, but yet are not like any other kind of storytelling that we have. This is a thing that's happening that is going from the mind of a creator to the experience of somebody who is having to respond and interact with what you're making. And that, to me, is the thing that makes me not have a connection at 5 o'clock in the morning, face to face with the bestie or wiser, and instead to feel kind of really excited and hopeful about where those kind of projects might take us. So, smaller, more abstract things. Maybe let's get those right first, maybe. Nobody, I don't think they remembered to put the rotten vegetables on the table as you came in to throw at me, but if anybody's brought some, you're super welcome. I went really fast because I was worried that we were running late, so now I'm done and there's loads of time, so if you want to ask me any questions or just shout at me, that would be fine. Thank you very much. So part of why we're working at the South Bank Centre is we are currently artists in residence there. So which is nuts, right? We're a game design studio and we're artists in residence at the South Bank Centre. That still does my head in. And it's really challenging. I mean, it's a really daunting question to be asked as a game designer is what art are you going to make? Because suddenly you really, really have to have something to say, and we're still, this is new to us and we're still kind of working towards that. But Hide&Seek's heritage is formed a lot by working with artists, working with poets, working with theatre makers. And I think a kind of part of both my pessimism and my optimism a little bit is born out of that. So we did a lovely project. I promise we're not as poetry obsessed as I'm currently making it seem, but we did a project at the Edinburgh Festival this summer called Hinterland that was a poem you can play. So that started life as a game called the London Poetry Game, where we would commission a poet, great, fantastic poet called Ross Sutherland, and he would write a poem each year, and each year we would take every line of the poem and translate it into a different language that was spoken in London. And then we'd publish the poem where every line was in a different language. There's a phone number, and there would be effectively really a competition to see who could find people who spoke all those different languages. So you ran around the South Bank going, do you look like you might speak Polish? Is that Polish? Can you translate this thing? And you'd give them the phone, and they'd translate the line. And we'd tabulate all of those, and you would win if you got the most. And then we'd build this whole sound sculpture out of the poem that you get back, where we blend together all of the translations, some of them accurate, some of them not so accurate, some of them utterly filthy and inappropriate, into a kind of whole lovely thing. And it was kind of a nice art project, but it wasn't really a game. It wasn't really any fun for the people who played it. And so we, I haven't got any photos handy. This year we evolved it into a thing called Hinterland, which was a much more structured kind of game experience that took you out into the city. How do you do things? Had a much more sophisticated kind of tech underpinning and a super cool physical output. I can show you pictures later. But it's incredibly experimental. This stuff's still really fragmentary and kind of not there yet. So I still have really big questions about how you can meaningfully make art that functions in a way that satisfies me as a game maker. The imposition of the gaming structure on top of it is incredibly hard. So we made a game last year called Couple Up, which is so busted. It's super broken, but it was designed to be broken, and it's a parlour game. It's a parlour game about a bunch of quite interesting stuff. It's a parlour game about how you tackle making art participatory. So on the face of it is this incredibly lame parlour game about making friends at a dinner party. So you have a bunch of little tasks where you've got to find somebody who's a number card that complements your number card, and then you've got to find somebody beyond that with whom you have compatible fortunes. So you have little kind of fortune cookie things saying, oh, your new friend has 2 children, or your new friend was born in France, or whatever it was, and you've got to try and match up. And then once you've found your partner, you're allowed into another room, and that room very crucially has 2 things in it, which is air conditioning and wine. So that's the room that you want to get into, but there is a bouncer who you have to get past, and it gradually becomes apparent that he's setting arbitrary rules which you then have to navigate and decide how to respond to, and you can figure it out, and you can solve the puzzle, or you can cheat, or you can do all the rest of that. And you think all of that is what's going on, except really what's going on is it was a mechanism to take a room full of people who didn't think that they were players or actors, and then funnel a sequence of them through so that what you end up with at the end of the game is an audience in this room of people who have made it through and have successfully navigated the obstacles, looking back at suddenly these 4 performers who are left, who didn't intend to be performers, who didn't realise that's where this was going, but who are now kind of exposed and implemented and implicated in all this in the ways that they didn't expect. Super interesting to work on. Is it a good game? Definitely not. Is it art? Not of a kind that I'm kind of proud of. Was it useful for us to kind of move through? Completely. And we do, in a lot of our live work, we do a whole bunch of stuff. There's a lovely game we run in our events each year called Movie House, which is a kind of networked distillation of a bunch of kind of New York happenings in the 60s that were based in cinema. So there's a huge amount of stuff there. But again, I'd love to go, well, here are the 7 things that I think are unimpeachably brilliant that prove that this is an incredibly rich and fertile thing. I can't. I can point you to a load of super interesting efforts and hopes that they will evolve. The first point is super interesting. I think you're definitely right about the amateur thing. I'm always uncomfortable about the movie evolution time clock that we're judged against, not least because are those the 2 movies that you pick? There's ways you could pick it that would give us even less than 12 years, depending on what you wanted to pull out. You know, or are we allowed to time ourselves against the novel? That took a bit longer. You know, there is something seductive, but something a bit dangerous there. I mean, there's another argument that says the reason that we're so slow is because we're trying to do the wrong thing, that we've already found ways to accomplish the thing that linear stories in other mediums accomplish at a really, really root level. So there's a whole bunch of interesting and a whole bunch of narrative theory questions that we don't have time, I'm sure, to get into, and that I couldn't begin to do justice to anyway, about how deep you dig down through a bit of storytelling to decide what the root of it is, and at what point you're just digging your own new interesting hole that isn't anything that was in the story to begin with. You know, but I think, I don't know if anyone who was at GDC and made it to Frank Lance's talk about Go and poker, but he did a majestic hour on the ways in which those 2 games are about everything from, you know, the smallest domestic interpersonal relationship down to thousands of years of political and social history, and how much is encoded and embodied in these mostly abstract rule sets. So there's some interesting stuff within poker about the degree of narrative that you can pull out of what you those very sort of simple raw materials. So maybe, you know, maybe this is definitely where the rotten fruit comes out. Maybe we're just chasing the thing that we shouldn't be chasing, which is that telling stories that look like the stories that other kind of mediums tell isn't a smart play for us, and that we could be doing something else, something that is just as rich and subtle and just as embedded with really important things at the heart of the human experience, but which we can explore systemically rather than narratively. And I often feel like that. And I am very, very open to the criticism that I feel like that, because it's effectively a cop-out. It's a thing that is easier to do, and that I'm just running away from doing the super brave, proper storytelling that other people are trying to do because I'm not very good at it. I think that would be a very fair rotten vegetable to throw. But I do think it's important to say, to think about the fact that the answer for us may not look like the answer for other people, particularly in video games. I mean, I know now I do a lot more work in live games and games where you have human beings to respond to stuff and be imaginative and close that loop of intention and new action. When I'm making video games, I'm interested, you know, when I'm making games for people, I'm interested in the things that people are best at. My my God, the things that people are best at are brilliant. But when I'm making games for computers, I'm interested in what computers are best at. And they're also brilliant, but they're super different. And maybe it's fine that those things are different. There's at least two things there that are super interesting. That kind of intrinsic faith and trust, where you are, all the Magic Circle stuff, you are choosing to enter a constrained artificial system that you know someone else has set up, and in most cases, you expect that system to be consistent and reliable, and that's what frees you to do the stuff that you do in it. That's mostly incredibly important. It's lovely when we subvert it, but we all build on it most of the time. So that's a really important thing. I think when I was talking about truth earlier, I was going beyond that to talk about this thing, and this thing that is probably a mirage, but this thing that we chase, which is some sense of some kind of objectively real truth about the real world, whatever either of those two things are, and whether or not games can reflect that back to us. And I think there's a whole amount of stuff that's incredibly interesting about that we don't talk about very much. That's particularly interesting for video games. So video games keep the creator and the player apart, nearly always geographically, often through decades. But I always have a very strong sense of authorial presence in games, some more than others. Some games do that very deliberately. Some games have people's names at the front of them. You can't play Civ without knowing who made it. Some of them don't, but you still feel those guys there. So playing treasure games, say, there's 4 guys who made those, and you've lived with them for 20 years, and they've been tormenting you in all of that time, but also giving you this incredibly precious thing. And so that trust is both intrinsic and artificial, and extrinsic and real. That those guys build a fake system for me that I go into and trust the integrity of that fake system. But also I'm an actual person in the real world, and they are actual people in the real world, and I have a real debt of affection and admiration for them that is a different kind of trust from the one that I have in the game, or is it different or not? And I think we don't talk about it very much, and it's super interesting, not least because I think it would be nice for all kinds of game developers to get more contact with people, particularly video game developers, to get more contact with people who play their games and more sense of that communication, because that's fundamentally what it is. When I write a game in whatever way, whether it's a paragraph of text or something that we spend a year coding, I'm creating a thing. I'm making something that I love and care about, and then sending it out to touch weird strangers I've not met, and we don't get to close that loop very often. So there.
All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah.